All right, so we are starting a new chapter in the book, if you're following along in the book at all. I don't know how many of you have it, but we're into chapter 5. I've got some things in the slides about it, and the author makes a brief reference to it. It's kind of a popular theology, if you want to say it that way. Chad Bird takes theological concepts and he expresses them to us without the jargon very often. So if we were studying this as a dogmatics kind of class, we would say that the lesson today is particularly on the teaching of vocation. And vocation is a word that we use sometimes in our secular parlance also. But what we mean in the biblical understanding of it is a little different. And so we're going to lay some of those things out as we grapple with our purpose here, the work to which God has called us, and how we put our purpose and God's call together. So lesson 5, my altar has a diesel engine, not my altar here, but the author's in the book. I think we've talked about the fact that Chad Bird was a pastor in a Lutheran church and a couple of Lutheran churches along the way. And then for a while he was a professor, I believe, Old Testament at Concordia Lutheran Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Life went in such a way that he found his way out of the ministry. I don't know what all the circumstances are for that. But he ended up moving back to his home state of Texas, lives out someplace in West Texas, Panhandle area, I believe, and now drives a tanker oil truck, the kind that goes around and picks up the oil at the various pump jacks, take it to the refinery, that kind of thing. So that's what he does today. And that's the reference you have in the title of this chapter, chapter 5, My Altar Has a Diesel Engine. So he has served at a church altar in his life, but he serves in quite a different way today. Well, let's talk about the church altar a bit. Can we swing that TV around so I can see what you guys are looking at? That way I don't have to be looking over my shoulder. Good, thank you. All right, why do we have an altar in our churches? What does it symbolize? What is this piece of furniture about? You know, if you go down the sidewalk here to the church in Norman, they don't have an altar.
They don't?
They do not.
Oh.
They don't have a pulpit. They don't have a baptismal font as we think of it. They have a stage. And if you visit most of the evangelical churches in town, you will not find an altar or a pulpit or a lectern or what we think of as traditional chancel furnishings. Probably you'll have some kind of a stage. They may have a book stand like I use here for Bible class, and it might be a little fancier. It might be made out of plexiglass so you can see through it. But that is generally the way the minister is going to conduct the service. But we have this kind of holdover from Old Testament times to some degree. So why do we have altars in our churches? What does it symbolize?
They always had an altar, you know, when God did something, they would put an altar right there in the Old Testament.
What was the altar used for in the Old Testament?
Sacrifices.
They had two kinds.
Thanksgiving, maybe?
Partly?
Worship.
Worship. Sacrifice. Okay. So, you know, in our Christian churches today, this doesn't function the same way that an Old Testament altar did. It really does something quite different. So sometimes you have the picture in front of you now, what we call the freestanding altar, and that is something that became popular in Christianity a couple hundred years after Martin Luther. This was actually originally Martin Luther's idea, to have what they call a freestanding altar, where the minister can actually go around the altar and face the congregation. And the idea was that when I'm facing you, I'm proclaiming God's word and promises to you. But when we pray, once in a while, I don't usually pray facing you, because I'm not praying to you. I am leading you, I'm praying not to the television, but to God, right? That's a little bit of what those gestures are supposed to indicate. So if you have an altar where the minister can be on the front side of it and facing the front of the church, well, then you're praying to God. But there are certain places in the service where you might use the altar Where Luther felt it makes more sense for the minister to be facing the congregation, and it would be good if he could go around behind that thing and talk to the people. And that was in particular for the celebration of the Lord's Supper, consecration of the elements. Because when we do the Lord's Supper, that's not so much our offering to God, that's his offering to us. At that point in time, this serves as more like a table. And in some Baptist churches or evangelical churches, they may even have a communion table, but they, in many cases, don't refer to it as an altar. It's a table, and from which the thing is being served. Although the irony of that is that they actually understand the sacrament in some ways almost more like the Catholics. They don't believe Jesus' body and blood are actually there, but they believe it's something you're doing to God, not something he's doing for you. So you have the freestanding altar. Most of you have seen this one before.
Yeah.
That is kind of more traditionally. It was up against the wall, and often very decorative. This is really what they call a neo-Gothic architecture.
Recently.
It's always been a little bit jarring to me when I've gone to Holy Cross and they've got the neo-Gothic chancel furnishings in a 1970s modern building, but I suppose it kind of represents Lutheranism throughout the ages. You have that kind of an altar also, but you recognize it's different than the purpose of an Old Testament altar. Again, you put the elements on it, but you're serving the Lord's Supper from it. Now, there is one way in which we do use the altar. We haven't done it here since COVID so much. There's one way in which you use the altar to go that direction towards God. And maybe we don't even think of it this way. But when we take the offering, and the offering comes forward, generally those plates get placed on the altar. And that is an act of praise and worship to God. It's not spoken in that case. It's acted out. But that is certainly being brought from us to God. And we ought to think of that not as merely a practical matter of paying the church bills. But the reason that that has been included in the service is that we have this opportunity to respond to God's grace to us and to offer him our praise with our possessions, as well as with our mouths and our bodies. If you see video ever of our missions in places like Africa, you may know that they kind of do this processional with dancing, where every member brings his or her offering to the altar. They don't send ushers out to bring the plates back and forth. But each member approaches the altar individually and places their offering on the altar, again, as a matter of praise and worship to God, and it's usually accompanied in that culture with dancing along the way and singing. Sometimes they're very simple. This is a little Lutheran church in Sweden, a friend of mine, Stefan Hedqvist, in the north of Sweden. And just a little table. When we started here, we didn't have this nice piece of furniture that Fred Jenkins built for us. And before this one, we did have one that Don ordered online for us and finished. That looks actually quite similar, just a little wider. We needed the room, so Fred rebuilt one that's probably just as nice, maybe even a little more solid, that fits the space better. But before that, we had a folding table. Plastic folding table with metal legs. Threw a tablecloth over it, and away we went. And what you have here is, it's not a folding table, but you see, it's just a little wooden table. It's got a cloth over it. It's about this big. They have a little congregation, and that's their altar. But these are the kinds you had in the Old Testament. So somebody pointed out the altar of sacrifice. That's the bigger one here. And I don't know that I even always conceived of it this way, but it was really designed like a big barbecue pit. So you had metal, and you had a grate, and you built a fire inside of there, and you put the animals up on the grate, and they cooked. Probably the animals didn't light on fire while they're up there, in most cases. They cooked. Sometimes, if you have a barbecue grill at home, without necessarily lighting the steak on fire, you can reduce it to ashes just sitting on the grate. And one of the 4 sacrifices that God had commanded the olah, the whole burnt offering, which was in part to symbolize total dedication to God, was left on the altar until the whole thing disintegrated into ashes and fell through the grate. But 3 of the sacrifices were simply cooked, and after a portion of the animal was perhaps let to be burned up, or left there long enough to burn up, most of the meat was taken back off. And in 2 of the sacrifices, it was used to feed the priests and the Levites. And in 1 sacrifice, it was actually used also as a fellowship meal between God and the worshiper. So the worshiper got to eat that meat as a way of saying the relationship with God is reestablished. When you sit down to eat with somebody, it's an expression of friendship, generally speaking. Unless you're at a diner, you probably don't sit at a table with somebody who's a complete stranger. You sit there with people that you know well.
That's the modern world.
You celebrate with family.
Yeah.
Right. It would be weird if you're up the street at Applebee's or Chili's or something, and you've got your table, your booth, and the waitress brings 2 other people that you've never seen before over to your table and seats them with you. Again, if you're at a diner, it might be a little different. Or if you go down to some of these German restaurants, like if you go down to Das Boot Camp here in town, which is a spin-off of Royal Bavaria up on Sooner Road, there in kind of the German beer hall style, they'll have rows of picnic tables strung together. And there you might be kind of just sharing space with whoever else comes in. But generally speaking, we expect the people we eat with to be people we're close with. And that was communicated in the fellowship offerings that the people brought, where they actually got to eat some of the same sacrifice that they brought to God as a way of expressing the kinship, the fellowship, the oneness that they had with Him. So this kind of... obviously, we're not starting a fire under this thing anytime soon because it would burn up. The other kind of altar that you had was the altar of incense. And here too, you had to have an altar built in such a way as to accommodate fire. Now you're not offering animals on it, but you are burning up incense. And the idea there was that as the smoke of the incense rose, it symbolized the prayers of God's people going up to God. It's a quote from the Psalm. It's in our Vesper service. "Let my prayer rise before you as incense, and the lifting up of my hands is the evening sacrifice." So the altar of incense. But it's quite a different thing that you have here, purpose-wise, than what we have here. So our altars are places where we bring God our
Prayers and requests.
prayers. Again, when we say the prayer, I'm back to you. My back is to you. We're at the altar. I don't usually say the prayers from the pulpit. I say the prayers from the altar, so it symbolizes us bringing our prayers to God, our praises and thanksgivings to God. The other thing I mentioned that comes to the altar, not so much now in the way we're doing things currently, but we may get back to our offerings. God brings us His.
Bread of life.
Yeah, He brings us the Lord's Supper. In the New Testament church, from the altar that we have, which is more table-like, Christ's body and blood, which aren't sacrificed here, that was sacrificed on the cross, are still distributed here. It still retains that feature of the Old Testament sacrifice when it is brought to us to receive. So God's bringing us His grace and His gospel in His supper from the altar. All right, our author Chad Bird compares the diesel truck he drives for a living after he left the ministry to the altar at which he served as a pastor. In what ways are they similar and what ways are they different? Shouldn't have trouble thinking of differences. Maybe it's a little bit more thought to figure out how they are in any way similar. In what ways are they similar and what ways are they different? My altar has a diesel engine.
Well, he's mobile.
So that's on a different
Yeah,
side.
yeah.
He spends
You
all
can have a mobile altar. Again, sometimes when you're in a church where you have to set up and take down every Sunday because it's the little mission church. Okay, we had the table that was, the reason we used a little plastic table is because this is really heavy to lift around, so you have something more mobile. And I know that in some churches that have been established in elementary school gymnasiums and such. So they'll have a trailer, and they will have specifically designed all the furnishings to try to make them as easy as possible to get in and out in a short period of time, because it's got to be done every Sunday. But generally speaking, the mobility is a unique thing. All right.
But the similarity could be that he still is capable of presenting the gospel to people. even though
Okay,
he's-
in his
yeah.
work as a truck driver, the truck is going to, the calling, the work that he's doing is going to put him into interaction with other people. And as such, may give him the opportunity still to pray and worship God.
He's energy to other people. He's bringing. I mean, it looks like he's driving a. I don't know if this guy drives a fuel truck like that, but if he does,
Yeah, it's a big tanker, big 18-wheeler kind of tanker.
and he's bringing energy, power to other in service to other people.
Okay, so he is in service to people, right? He
Right.
is serving people.
And he's bringing something from point A to source to sink.
And so God serves us from this altar, and he uses me as a mediary to bring those things to you. And God is still not, it's a different kind of service. Probably not the gospel in most cases, but he is still bringing Christian love and service from God to the various people in his life as a result of the particular calling that he has, right? So that would be something of a similarity. Well, and we said also, when we are at this altar, often we are bringing something to God, whether prayers or offerings. And if we properly understand what we do in our secular jobs, or what he's doing there, he is using his gifts and talents and offering them, not just to people, but in as much as he is loving and serving people, he's offering that to God also. So God is still using him to serve people from there. He may have the opportunity to share the gospel. He certainly has the opportunity to at least share Christian love. And God continues also to be served at that altar, if you will.
He's a good citizen. You truck drivers, I'm told, I don't really know, that long haul truck drivers are usually they're good drivers and they're respectful, and they'll let you in, I mean,
Generally speaking, they can't be the kind of aggressive drivers who are going to have road rage, or they're not going to hold their job very long. And they've had to learn how to accommodate the smaller cars that maybe are less accommodating out on the road. And they're the kind of people who are maybe most likely to sometimes stop and help someone who needs help alongside the road. There's a kind of a brotherhood, a fraternity that they have among themselves.
There's occasionally a preacher that has a grenade in his other hand. That,
Once in a while, maybe.
we hope we don't run into them
Very often.
Very often.
All right. The author here. I've come to see that so many of the assumptions we have about our careers, employment, and vocations are in a complete contradiction to the divine vision for our lives. In worst case scenarios, they suck the soul right out of us, leaving us despising our jobs and living only for the weekends. I don't know, who was it? Old group Loverboy. Everybody's working for the weekend was a popular song when I was in high school. It's high time to change that. It's high time to recapture the sanctity of our callings and the priestly character of all our labor, as well as to realize that our altars have diesel engines, old diaper bags, and support laptops. So he wants to help us get rid of the division we often have in our minds between the sacred, the holy, the religious, the spiritual part of our lives, and the secular part of our lives, because we don't stop being Christians. The lesson deals in with scripture teaching we call the doctrine of vocation, as I had announced at the beginning. Among the failings it champions, so he's talking about these things we fail to do. He talks about failing at finding our callings. Now, you all have callings, many of them. It's not that you're going to fail to have callings, but in the sense that there is one unique calling to us, and we have to search the world out, and if we don't find what that is, somehow that's a bad thing. And he's saying, well, we need to talk more about what it means to have a calling in that sense, and how much we ought to be wringing our hands about finding just the right one. Seeking the fulfillment and purpose that we so desire at work. In other words, our careers, our jobs, as opposed to our other vocations. So that's another sometimes false dichotomy we set up. Okay, my life at church and my service to the kingdom. My life at my job. And that's where my real purpose and fulfillment come from. My life in my family, my life as a citizen. And we compartmentalize those things so much. Need to rethink that. Finding a secular career, kind of similar to one, which does not involve our Christian faith. So getting somewhat rid of overemphasizing this distinction between secular and sacred. So, do we make a living, or does our living make us? Which of the following pressures did you feel from family and friends when you were in high school? 1, go to college. 2, decide on your career. 3, go to some particular career.
Go to college. Go to college.
Go to college.
Yeah.
Once in a while, I've run into a high schooler where, and it's just an assumption we have today, and I'll ask, so you got a school picked out after high school. Not everybody's going to do that. Not everybody's settled on one, and some people, I think more and more so, they're feeling emboldened and empowered to say so. But for a long time, it was like this expectation that, if you don't go on to a college or university someplace, there's something less about you. But there's often a pressure that just assumes you got to go on to a next step.
Our society, maybe in the 50s or sometime 100 years before that, education was thought to be a pathway for people who were poor to become slightly less poor or something.
Well, is there some truth to that?
Yeah, there is.
I think statistically you can say there's some truth to that. It still doesn't mean it's everybody's path, right?
Yeah, I think in the 50s it was like, they blew this rocket up and stuff like that. Oh, there's plenty of jobs for chemists and, engineers and stuff like that.
My grandfather, who had an 8th grade education
Yeah.
and was a farmer his whole life, took pride in the fact that all 5 of his children, 2 sons and 3 daughters, went to college and got their bachelor's degrees. That was a point of pride for my grandfather. And I'm not saying that was wrong. And they were all capable of it. They all did it. But like so many things, we overemphasize, perhaps. And it may not be for everybody. Deciding on your career. When did you decide what you were going to be? When did you settle?
Some of us that went to we did a vocational.
Okay, which is it may not be college or university in terms of a Bachelor of Science or Bachelor of Arts degree, but it is still secondary education, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And then it was the computers were new and
A lot of emphasis on that kind of thing.
and a lot of the guys did the computers, so.
How many of you ended up going into the field that you thought you might like when you were, say, 8 or 10 years old?
Didn't exist.
Didn't exist, okay? In some-
Well, I
Well,
don't know.
maybe.
Okay.
How many of you ended up going into the field you thought you might like when you were in high school? Okay, interesting. I don't see how science. I don't see. How many of you were in college and still ended up doing something different than that was preparing you for? All right. So I'll tell you that someplace late in grade school, I was convinced that I was going to become a Lutheran elementary school teacher. I maybe have told you the story. I went to a one-room school. Steve Rutchow, who was the principal and teacher of grades 1 to 8, also taught piano lessons at my house. He was a great storyteller. He was a single man his whole life. He arranged to have piano lessons at a different person's house every night, and he had supper with that family every night as well. He had it figured out. Okay? Didn't have to cook, didn't have to do dishes. And he would sit around the table and he would keep us in stitches with his stories of his teaching ministry and his college life at Dr. Martin Luther College. And I was going to be a teacher. And I had him in the classroom all day, and this is what I wanted to do. When I got to confirmation class, my pastor urged me to at least consider the possibility of becoming a pastor. And in high school, I was kind of not sure which one. But the further I got on, the further I moved towards pastoral ministry. And I've had an opportunity, I have 4 actually, to go back into teaching ministry at the college level. But it changes for people, right? Probably changed for you along the way. But often there's some pressure to want to have that kind of figured out already by the time you're in high school. And then to have it be something special. You know, it can't just be any old job, but it's got to be something that sets you apart. It's going to make a difference in the world. It can't just be work. That's the way that people tend to think. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with doing something that is unique and that may set you apart and that will make an impact that might garner you some public attention. It's not wrong. But is that really the purpose of it all? And should we feel a pressure about that? Someone, kind of in a similar vein, was joking about knowing a bunch of people who believed in reincarnation, and these people who have a sense of, in my previous life I was, it's not only that they have adopted this Eastern mysticism about being reincarnated, but they've had dreams, or they feel inside that they were so-and-so in their past life. And when you look at what they were in their past life, they never say they were a ditch digger in their past life, right? They never say that they were a rice farmer in their past life. The man was joking that he was amongst a whole room of these people once, and 2 of them happened to be Napoleon in their past life. But this idea that we have to be special, well, it's putting a lot on your career to draw that sense of validation and self out of it. Maybe that's not what that is for. Or maybe it's just one little piece of a much larger puzzle. And the pressure should be off. We've got a couple of people about that age here in the room today, right? It's okay to look around. It's okay if what you do seems a little mundane and ordinary compared to what the world seems to praise. It's also okay to do something that is absolutely unique and will garner you a lot of attention. But you can take the pressure off. And then go into some particular career. And that's maybe a reference to the fact that if you grew up in a family where great-grandpa did this, and then grandpa did it after him, and then your dad did it, there's kind of an expectation that you'll follow in the footsteps. You'll take over the family business. They can run on the... I mentioned the male side. That doesn't say that the same thing doesn't happen on the female side. That there's expectation you're going to do what mom did, what grandma did. And maybe that's not for you. Maybe that's not you. So how is it different for young people a couple of centuries ago?
80% that were working on the farm or something like that. I mean, a choice in your career, what's that?
Yeah.
Why would I that worked. We didn't starve to death the last 3 generations, or occasionally we did, but not too much. And why would I go outside and take a chance to do something where I probably will starve? If I don't plant the same thing, the same time, the same way.
So the Industrial Revolution offered and opened up a lot of opportunity to rethink some of this. But at one point in its time, the United States was well over 90% agrarian in what it did. And what you say is also then true, that it didn't make you wealthy as many people think about wealthy, but you ate. Anecdotally, someone who lived through it once told me that in the 1930s, people who grew up in all these dairy farms in Wisconsin almost didn't know that there was a depression, because most of those farms were pretty self-subsisting. most of the food came right off the farm. You milked the cows, and you probably, at that point in time, didn't put all your eggs in one basket, so you probably had chickens, and you probably had hogs, and maybe sheep as well. And you had a half-acre garden in which you grew many things, and other than once in a while needing to get some clothes, and maybe mom was even sewing those. And I know during World War II that they started selling flour in sacks that had, they were cotton sacks that had patterns on them, so that after the flour was used up in the sack, you could turn it into a shirt or a dress or something. Some of you are nodding your head like you remember that. Okay. So the economy could do, who cared what was going on in the New York Stock Exchange? It didn't affect you. Didn't affect you at all. People were always going to need to eat. There was going to be a market for what you were making. And frankly, even if there wasn't, you could kind of downsize it all to just take care of your family on that plot of land, assuming you owned it.
You could sell your eggs or whatever in a local market around your town where you could 20 miles into town and back once a month or something. But there wasn't a global market where you looked at the Hansford Headlight or the Kansas City Star and said, oh, cattle are up, blah, blah, blah. Time to take them to...
So when I was growing up, my grandfather listened religiously to the livestock reports from the South St. Paul livestock market. And, pigs were here today and cattle were selling at this today. And they were trying to figure out when's the best time to bring them up there. Kind of watching where the trends were going, but even that wasn't absolutely necessary. And sometimes it was just down. You survived. You got through it.
And before the railroad and before the railroad and other mass transportation like that, there wasn't a mass market. If you grew wheat in New England, you could sell it in New England. You weren't competing with big wheat farms back west over the... And
now we've come so far that, somewhat ironically, one of the big things at restaurants and some small groceries is farm to table, right? They want you to
local.
Source it locally. Don't get it from Argentina, or don't get it even from Archer Daniels Midland Farms in the middle of Illinois. Get it from some local source. All right, so those things have changed. So I don't know that my grandfather ever thought about being anything other than a farmer, because it had been in the family for generations, and it was just what you did. And he didn't think that there was a whole lot of other opportunity. He didn't sweat this at all. And so even if you were in other trades, if you were in the original colonies of the United States and you were a blacksmith, probably your children would follow in those footsteps. It just tended to be how it was. So what does the word vocation mean? The word vocation is a word that comes from Latin. It's one of the very first Latin words I learned, because when I was in Latin, it was the word we used for conjugating the verb, voco. Vocation comes from a word that means to call. And so your vocation is your calling. Now we use that term, and I think often we don't really think about the concept of calling with it, what that really says about it. The concept of a calling and of God calling people is all over the scriptures, and it is in a number of different contexts. The first one we think about it biblically here is the kind of thing you see in Hebrews chapter 5. So every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. No one takes this honor upon himself. He must be called by God, just as Aaron was. Now today, I suppose in terms of the world's acceptance of it, anybody can hang out their shingle and say, I'm a preacher and I'm starting a church. But biblically, you didn't have people competing to take over Aaron's job at the temple. You didn't have people competing for the apostles' job with Jesus. And nobody's competing with me for the altar or the pulpit here this morning, right? The idea that you had to be called by God, that there had to be a selection from outside of you. It wasn't just something for which you volunteered. It was something that had to come from the outside of you. That God called to you, I want you to do this for me. And there was positions besides the priesthood, but the priesthood would have been a typical example of it. So sometimes it speaks of someone called to be kind of the category here.
Preach.
Okay, to preach, to serve in God's kingdom, to serve in the work of the church in New Testament times, the temple and synagogue in Old Testament times, but it would be that kind of a spiritual calling to serve God's people with God's word. But that's not the only way. Matthew 22:14. For many are invited, and the Greek there is actually called, but few are chosen. Well, what kind of call is that? It's not the work of the church. It's a call to,
Salvation.
yeah, the call to salvation, the call to faith. So again, we've, in popular culture, especially under the influence of American evangelicalism, we have this idea of you choosing God. The scripture never thinks of it that way. It thinks of it flipped. Many are called. God is out there calling people, right? It comes from outside of you. He calls you to himself. Jesus called his disciples, now that was more the church work, but he called the masses to faith in him. And so as Christians, we have been called to faith. We've been called to believe Jesus. We've been called to follow him. So sometimes it's that kind of a reference. This is the one we maybe don't look at so much, 1 Corinthians 7:17. Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life the Lord assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. So anybody know 1 Corinthians chapter 7? You know the book of 1 Corinthians well enough to know what the overall topic is in this chapter?
I'm guessing it
Throw it
had
out
to do
there.
with the body, the difference of the body.
One thing, yeah,
the
one part of it.
analogy of the body,
The
many parts.
no, that's coming up in chapter 12.
Okay.
That's coming up in chapter 12, where you're going with that part. It's chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians is about marriage. So the congregation had some questions about the appropriateness of marriage and what, how it should be done and the lifelong nature of it. So there's a bunch of things that Paul covers in this chapter. But as he's trying to lay out to them, if you're a single person, is that a bad thing? If you are a married person, is that a bad thing? And the church has swung back and forth on this, right? Sometimes we have this expectation, a little bit like we talked about with the careers before, that young people are going to find their life partner and they have to get married. Is that an obligation? No. But the church doesn't always appreciate people who don't have a spouse as much, it would seem. And the other part of it is there's been a whole bunch of church history in which what was elevated to be the highest way of life was to forswear marriage and live celibate. And now you are living at a higher level of holiness, and that was the problem at the time of the Reformation. So, you could get a wife and you weren't sinning by doing so, but you weren't quite as good as that monk who had said, I will give that up for God. And the fact is that Paul says, each one should retain the place in life the Lord assigned to him and to which God has called him. There's a freedom here, and you don't have to go with one or the other. But recognize that if you find yourself in a marriage, there's a calling of that. And if you find yourself living a single life, there is also a calling from God to that. And as he's making this point, he actually, in this chapter, we're going to look at it a little bit more detail later in this part of the study, broadens that out to other things in life. Like if you're a slave, what we might think of more as, your secular career back then. He says, don't sweat that. God might have, in a sense, really kind of called you to serve in that position. He says, if you can get your freedom, do so, because you can do more for God if you're free. But recognize that there can even be a kind of calling in that position. And when it comes to the other things you do. So if you were today a farmer, if you are an engineer, if you're a teacher, we could list bunches of them. You are in that also. I mean, you didn't get a written piece of paper that, like I've gotten the file in my office. It said, Grace Lutheran Church of Norman, Oklahoma calls you to be our shepherd. Okay, I've actually got a piece of paper. If somebody asks me, are you called by God? I can actually take the piece of paper out and show you. You may not have that in what we might think of as secular careers, but that doesn't mean any less that God has arranged things to put you there and that he calls you to serve in that way. So, some of you work for the FAA, some of you work for the military, some of you worked in research, some of you have worked in fast food.
Health department.
The health department, callings, okay? And we don't always think of it that way, but you have a calling too. And it didn't necessarily, even if you felt like this is where I want to go with my life, Margaret, from a very young age, that doesn't mean that God wasn't still working things out. And when you served in a Lutheran school, like me, you could pull out the piece of paper and say St. Peter's, St. Peter's?
Christ St. Peter, yes.
Christ St. Peter's Lutheran Church of Milwaukee, Wisconsin has called you to feed the lambs in our congregation. You are called by God. I'll have more to say about that in a little bit.
At the state agency in Oklahoma that handles Medicaid in the year 2000, there were 200 employees there, and many of them felt that they were called to help the poor in this healthcare related area. It wasn't just a job with the state,
All right.
a job. I'm sure many people also felt like that was an evil thing. And they, every year when we got close to the legislature, it would be like we'd get in our little trenches and there was incoming rounds aimed at the health at the Medicaid, that agency. But
So some people often do have this sense of the fact that what I have is something more than just a function that I'm carrying out.
right.
There's something outside of me.
It's not just medical claims, it's medical claims for people who are indigent.
Yeah.
That's the way it,
Yep.
there were more of them. There were 100 so of them upstairs.
Okay. So I see we're at the end of time. Quick, oops, no. Oh, we're not as far as I thought we were. Whoops. That's probably as good a place to break as anyway. I thought we had the next section coming up, but we'll stop it there. So we'll talk more about this idea of vocation and calling, some of the vocations and callings that we might find ourselves in, and broaden that out for next time. So good to see all of you on this chilly day.